Hi, welcome to A Gray Barn Rising. I'm here this evening with Bootsy Beagle, as I am every evening, and I'm reading the poems tonight of the Chilean poet Enrique Lihn, who lived from 1929 to 1988. He's considered an anti-poet, and an anti-poet is a poet who questions the premises of what a poem does or should do. What I mean by that is an anti-poem will question whether or not a poem is a mystical or magical activity, and in doing so will often be irreverent. It will flatten out the language, the discourse. It will often be prose-like, and it will illuminate human foibles, and in particular an anti-poet will poke fun at him or herself in doing that. So I'm going to read this evening from an older collection of Enrique Lihn entitled The Dark Room and Other Poems. This was one of the only translations we had of his work many years ago. But I'll also read from a more recent book, Figures of Speech. This is translated by David Oliphant. The Dark Room and Other Poems has a number of translators, but this is edited by Patricio Lerzundi. I'll try to remember to give you the particular translators when I read the poems from this collection, as I will now. I'm going to read a translation by Jonathan Cohen, and this is an Enrique Lihn poem entitled Poetry, Speak Up. Poetry, speak up. It's been 3 months since I've written a line. It's been ages since I've made love, in the strict sense of the word. My own dreams wreck the heart of my sleep while the sun brushes its teeth, and the shadows in the house get dressed like people. Shame on you, poetry. Speak up. What are you waiting for? Ah, shit. An I or an oh. Will you end up like that? In bed with a gesturing corpse? They'll say, all we needed was to see him get up on a table. The rotten little word master. Now we've got him. His poetry works for him in a coffee shop. For you, 3 months are not enough as far as a whole life of oh and I is concerned. And it's summer, so to speak, and you would be better off pitching your flute to jackasses. And the least inspired philosopher in the 18th century figured out the balance of your poetry, a big pile of muck stirred by chance. Tell me, where will you draw out the breath to mix with the breath stirring up that big pile? Better yet, think how silly it is to pretend you can change the world. Laugh yourself to death. Somebody once said, the poet is a little god. A little god? Wait. With any luck at all, maybe luck won't smile on you again, though it may laugh politely in your face. You still have to cross another night. Perhaps you will find the wreckage of a boat in the company of one of your old girlfriends. You are the favorite with these lone women. At 36, you are in place among emigrants from no man's land. Again, you can see, I think, the whole idea that in that poem he's questioning poetry. Now, not every anti-poem will question poetry, but again, it still has that irreverence and, like I said, the flattened out lines, the discourse that are more prose-like in many ways. It's a little poem of his translated by, I think this is a David Unger translation. Yes, David Unger translation, and this poem is entitled Christmas. Do we have the courage to get together again this evening? Brothers and parents, the girlfriend with no place to go, the friendly neighbor, and the close childhood friend. What would it be like without him? Will he find the road from his heart to ours this evening? The thistle has dethroned the children we once were, and now ghosts lost in its kingdom. We're out in the desert looking for a street, the street of our childhood, the good road between the dust and ourselves, looking for our tears in the pools of standing water. I love the closing to that poem because another thing about an anti-poem is it often looks at seemingly mundane imagery, like a pool of standing water in this case, and locates human emotion and human motivation in the mundane things, of the seemingly mundane things of the world. So it's very contemporary in that regard. So I'd like to move now to some of his later poems. He was actually, before he was a writer, he began as an art student and failed at art and became a writer, but he has some poems about art, and this poem is entitled Art and Life. It's a very short poem, but again it will have these qualities that I spoke about earlier. And these are David Oliphant translations now. People who circle around the museum pieces, forgetful of their condition as museum pieces, and who seem well to ignore where they are. The Metropolitan Museum of Art is a work of art accomplished by their artistic lavatories. We are works of art momentarily alive. Here's another little art poem of his called Kandinsky, 1904. The relation of some things to others was, little by little, erasing things. Poems without words, forms without figures. Hardly had a ship of gold left the shore, than already there was no shore, no ship, no departure. So I wanted to give you a little taste of how his work varies and varied over the years. Now, he was working on a book. He wrote a book. He had cancer, and he wrote a book in the last 6 weeks of his life. He actually finished editing the book the night before he left the body. And this book is entitled Diary of Death. So I thought what I might do is go ahead and give you the final poem called Charmed Roadside Memorial. And you know, he didn't just wait until he had a terminal disease to write about death. Death was a preoccupation of Enrique Lihn's for many, many years. Charmed Roadside Memorial. It has turned me into a charmed roadside memorial among the truckers and their families, a little house of death, candlelit with piety, fresh flowers daily at its feet. I have turned myself into an actor who is going to die, but actually, in the final scene, into a famous acrobat with no safety net, who dances on the tightrope from night to night. The telephone rings constantly in my dressing room. They can't call me to cancel my stage appearance. They do it just to beg me to save them tickets if it's only for Act 3. People mill about dear to my now empty but not indifferent heart. And those who are thousands of miles from it, these latter out to get right with Jesus, they're paralytic, using me to receive absolution at the very last minute. Out of politeness, I'm going to waste with the little life left to me, the happiness of dying. entertaining losers like those. Death is a big attraction. For me, 12 persons are enough. I don't want any more to attend. He still maintains his sense of humor, even in the face of death, and I think that's why I wanted to share that poem with you, to show that this is a kind of consistent, rather consistent sensibility that he had throughout his life and throughout his life's work as a poet. So that's a brief sampling of the poetry of the Chilean poet Enrique Lihn, and I read from The Dark Room and Other Poems, and also from Figures of Speech. I hope you seek out his work. I think it raises some really interesting issues about poetry and language, and it's also very entertaining. Thank you so much for joining Bootsy and me for another episode.